For many years, a small hut stood in an opening in the heart of the Black Forest. There was not another dwelling within 20 miles. The hut was solitary, as the forest was a solitude. An old couple of singularly simple habits had lived there for 40 years. A half-acre of forest land cleared away was their garden, and twice a year they trudged on foot to the nearest market and sold what they could spare from their own necessities. Aside from this journey, they never went a mile from the cottage door. It needed but one look at the old man's mumbling lips and his bleary eyes, or to see the childish way he followed his wife about and did her bidding, to know that he was a foolish, harmless fellow, half idiot, half paralytic. As for the woman, her face showed more intelligence, but was even less pleasing. Her small blue eyes were crafty and relentless, and her parchment skin had sunk into forbidding lines about the mouth. However, she kept herself, as well as the foolish old man and the cottage, spotlessly clean. If she had been expecting the arrival of some dear friend every moment, she could not have been more scrupulous about sweeping the clay floor of her hut, or more careful to keep the husk mattress in the sleeping loft fresh and dry. She and her husband worked side by side in the garden, seldom exchanging a word, in stolid, pleasant fashion, except when she called out, "Here, Ludwig," wanting him to do something for her. The old man followed her indoors and out, his trembling lower lips hanging down, his vacant eyes watching her motions and trying to imitate them like a small child. Silently they worked together during the day, and silently they sat and smoked together on the bench in front of the house in the evening. As it began to grow dusk, the old woman, whom her husband called Junta, would take the pipe from her blackened teeth and hobble down to the road that rose and fell and crept away into the darkness of the forest. As long as the night lasted, she would stand, looking intently down the road, shading her eyes with both gnarled and crooked hands. Even after night had come, she waited, listening for many moments longer. Was she expecting guests? 12 years before, a man had stopped at nightfall and asked for a place to rest. He had made welcome, as the family depended largely for their living upon the occasional traveler through the forest. The man looked not only tired but sick, ate the merest mouthful of supper, and went up early to clean the loft. The man looked not only tired but sick, ate the merest mouthful of supper, and went up early to clean the little loft with its bed and sweet-smelling husk. He had not come down the next morning. Toward noon, Junta went up to waken him, thinking he would not want to continue his journey. And found him lying dead, with a stain of blood on the pillow under his cheek. There seemed to be nothing for them to do but bury him. It often happened that for 6 weeks together no one came near the hut, and Junta's brain was slow in expedients that it never occurred to her to go 20 miles to the nearest town for assistance or for a purpose other than selling cabbage or potatoes twice a year. Otherwise, someone might have become to help give the stranger a decent burial and see if there was any clue to his identity. But to Junta, a dead man was a dead man. There was nothing to do but bury him. So with only Ludwig, like a terrified child, to help her, she tried to make some such preparations as she had seen once or twice in her life. Under the stranger's vest, she found a heavy leather belt. She looked it over, felt of it, and at last cut it open. Handful after handful of gold coins slid out on the floor. Ludwig sprang to snatch up some of the shining objects, but Junta held his hands back. "No, Ludwig, no," she cried out sharply. "They are for Erfurt. We'll keep them for him. There's a good Ludwig." Trembling with eagerness, she gathered the gold into her apron, and Ludwig never saw it again. He dug a grave in the forest for the stranger, and together they carried him out and buried him. After Junta had gone back to the house, Ludwig, for reasons of his own, drove a large iron spike up to its head in the tree and rolled a stone on the grave, which he had leveled off so smoothly and covered with sod so neatly that no one would have known the ground had been disturbed. After that, he came out once a day, rubbed his fingers over the spike head, and sat on the stone for a few minutes, chattering and mumbling in his senseless, uncanny way. From this time on, Junta seemed changed. Not that the death of the poor gentleman made her sad, but she thought night and day of Erfurt and the hidden gold. Erfurt was her only child, and she loved him as all mothers, good and bad, love a son who was handsome and masterful. He had always been good to her. He had never beaten her, as many a son that she knew of did his mother, and when he went away years ago, he had said in his hearty way, "Save all you can from the garden, mother, and I'll save all I can, and after a while I'll come back, and we'll put it together, and you'll also be able to go away from this little hut and keep the house for me." Since then, she had never wasted a potato or a cabbage or a morsel of goat milk's curd. All had been taken to the market, yet she had been able to save in all 1/50th part as much as she had found in that leather belt. She began to have wicked thoughts. She knew where a plant grew in the forest that her mother had told her about. You might steep it in goat's milk, and no one would know by the taste that there was anything in it. But if a man were to take even a half cup of it at night, he would never awaken in the morning. She thought of the small sum she had been able to save. Erfurt might come back any day, and when he saw how little money she had, he would think she had not cared to help him or wished to live with him, when the one thing she did care for was to have a splendid box full of gold coins and to be able to say, "Here, Erfurt, they are yours, enough to buy a good house and a cow and a double acre." In imagination, Junta often went through the whole process of steeping the little green leaves in milk, mixing some of it with the cakes she would be baking for some traveler's supper, and ending by pouring the rest of it in the mug of milk. Then she would picture herself waking in the morning to find him still and harmless, and her joy at the gain of another handful of beautiful gold for Erfurt. She went through these scenes so often that at last it seemed as though she had already done the deed. And when a man stopped one night and strode around arrogantly while he waited for his supper, it seemed almost a matter of course that she would do in reality what she had so fancied herself doing. Many times during the night she awoke, crept to the foot of the ladder leading to the loft, and listened. Once she heard groans and struggling breaths, and then she hurried back to bed. In the morning she found the stranger, just as her mother had said, and sewed into his doublet were gold pieces larger than Junta had ever seen before. When she had called Ludwig up into the loft to help lift the body down, he expressed no surprise, but mumbled and laughed in his meaningless way, and afterward dug the grave, drove another spike into a tree, and rolled up the stone as he had done once before. During the next 12 years, Junta laid aside many a handful of precious coins, and it took Ludwig some time to go the rounds in the forest, searching out the nail heads, setting a few moments on each stone, kicking his feet about among the leaves, and muttering strange things to himself. Junta felt no reproaches from her conscience. Her moral nature was slow-moving and Ophidian, and she had been taught the harm of being found out rather than the wrong of the sin itself. Moreover, her love for her son was about as narrow and exclusive as the tiger's love for her young, and she was capable of crunching the bones of victims in her lair with just a little reflection if Erfurt was to gain by it. She felt perfectly secure against the danger of being found out, as long as there was no one near but Ludwig, who watched whatever was going on as the blackbirds did, and was just as likely to make an intelligent report of it. It happened that there had been no one through the forest for many weeks. Junta was making her usual observation of the road from under her twisted fingers when a horseman clattered up and wanted to know if he could have some supper and a night's lodging. "I can only give you a clean bed in the loft and a plain supper," answered Junta in her humble manner. "Well, be quick about it. I had an early dinner," said the stranger, leaping from his horse and stretching his legs as though he were tired from long riding. It did not take Junta long to see that the traveler was dressed in the finest of riding coats, and his horse fitted up with such trappings that she had never seen before. Junta hurried in to make supper ready and kept her watchful eyes on him through the little window as he swaggered around the yard with Ludwig at his heels. She saw that he frequently put his hand on one side of his waistcoat, as if to be sure something was there, and she knew what that meant. It was a sign that had never failed yet. At supper, he showed himself very friendly, asked if the old man was her husband, if she did not find the forest lonely, and if she had any children. She told him she had one son, and he asked her more questions in such a hearty, simple fashion that in spite of his unprepossessing appearance and the ugly fringe of the red beard around his chin and the lanky hair that fell over his collar, she was led on to talk more than she had for many years. So while she watched him sip his mug of milk, she told him how Erfurt went off to Sopdorf to make his fortune, and what a splendid lad he was, with curls all over his head, and such a grip in his jaw and his hands that he had cracked nuts with his teeth ever since he was 5 years old, and could throw a man in the market town. The stranger's eyes twinkled with amusement as the old woman's simple-hearted bragging, but he soon seemed to lose interest in it. Said he began to feel sleepy, and would talk again with her about her son in the morning. So Ludwig came to show him the way to the sleeping loft, and it was not long before the little hut was as silent as one of the trees of the forest in which it stood. In the morning, Junta sent Ludwig up as usual to go through the formality of calling the guest. He had been gone only a few minutes when she heard the shrill, terrible cries he always made when he was frightened. She clambered hastily up the ladder and found Ludwig wild-eyed and trembling from head to foot. He pointed with horror, first at the fringe of the red beard and wig of lanky hair that now lay on the floor, and then at the dead man extended lifeless on the cot. Junta saw at a glance the close-cropped curly hair, the powerful jaw, the handsome good-natured mouth, and threw herself upon the body with a heartbroken cry of anguish. She had killed her own son. The Guest Chamber by George Annabel. Published in Short Stories, a magazine of select fiction, Volume 10, in 1892. Narrated by Conan Stewart for Tales Reawakened on YouTube.